Policy making is not a linear process. If you can start with one thing in mind, the policy goal in mind, when you get into the field, you realize that it's a different context altogether. Our policy making process has to be very iterative, meaning that you start, you test it, you learn, and you adapt.
How can smart policies, within the context of what we just discussed, ensure that there's collective growth, that growth is meeting, the needs of both sides of the equation?
For me, I believe that our policies need to be inclusive. If you don't start with the first stage, which is the problem identification, which involves building the consensus, which involves actually reaching out to the right stakeholder groups, you're going to end up with policies that are not inclusive at the end of the day. Because if I'm not involved in the process, then you're not going to think about me. You notice that most times when policies are being designed, if you're in the National Assembly, for instance, and there's a public hearing, have you ever seen somebody representing a market women or representing?
Definitely not.
It's the posh organizations, the CSEA,
the people that can come in fancy cars.
And those people make up 95% of our population, but they're not included.
Hello, everyone. You're welcome to this episode of the CC podcast. I'm your host, Onyinye. And today we're talking about how smart policies shape economies. We are joined by Chinenye Uwanaka, founder of Africa Policy Conversations, a Pan-African nonprofit focused on leading transformation in Africa. You're welcome to the podcast, Ms. Chinenye. So we're talking today about smart policies, how smart policies can shape economies, help us build sustainable growth, help encourage innovation and good governance. So the reason I was even interested in talking about this topic is because of how Nigeria is with policies, right? We're good at writing things on paper, making sure that we took all the notes. On paper, we did the assignment, but implementation is where we have a very huge gap. So we're starting first with what the IMF even defines smart policy as. It sees it as doing less with more. And then, it emphasizes inclusive urban growth. But in Nigeria here, where, our ambitious plans always fall short when it comes to implementation. So what do you think truly distinguishes a smart policy from a well-meaning but ineffective one?
Yes, so thank you for that question. And like I mentioned, when you talk about smart policies, I think in Africa, we need to really think about what our own smart policies are. Because what might be smart for me as a Nigerian might not be what is smart for another country. And I mentioned the fact that, the IMF and the World Bank, although well-intentioned, a lot of their conditionalities, they call it the Washington Consensus, where you have the laundry list of what every country is asked to do. They tell you if you float your currency, if you remove subsidy, if you open up your markets, and all the other requirements that they have, that if you do all this is what is going to ensure that you have economic growth and job creation and the likes. However, we've seen in reality that is not always the case. And every country has its own peculiarities. So for me, I'd rather say that a smart policy is a policy that considers the local context and the realities on the ground. A smart policy also includes iteration and innovation. Because as we all know, policy making is not a linear process.
Yeah, it doesn't follow one direction.
Yes. If you can start with one thing in mind, the policy goal in mind, and then when you get into the field, you realize that it's a different context altogether. You also realize that there are unintended consequences of that policy. So our policy making process has to be very iterative, meaning that you start, you test it, you learn, and you adapt. You have to keep, and there has to be that feedback loop, that continuous feedback loop where you're looking at what the pitfalls are, what the challenges are, and you're able to adapt. If you want to course correct, you course correct. You don't have to wait 4 years, 5 years to the end of an administration before you do measuring and evaluation, monitoring and evaluation. And then you say, oh, this thing did not work. But then by that time, 5 years has gone, and maybe you're no longer going to be minister or president or, So
Yeah, I think it even feeds into the problem we currently have in Nigeria when it comes to data. So data is something that usually even lags behind, So we need like data to make good policies. And like you said, our policies have to be iterative. They have to pay attention to what is currently on ground.
Mm-hmm.
So for us to make policies that are smart, there's need for data, available data. There's need for us to be iterative. So yeah.
Thank you so much for even bringing up the point about data. And it really resonates with what I was saying earlier. With data, that's the crux. We don't have a lot of our policies are done based on emotions, based on what people just feel it's the right thing to do, politics, selfish interests, and all that. Meanwhile, we don't have that data that's actually saying this is where to go. We do have data in pockets of different agencies and all that, but the data is not aggregated in a way.
It's not unified.
Yes, that you can make a meaningful policy decision. That's also one of the projects I'm working on here. I'm cross-registered at MIT, and I'm working on a GovTech solution that would leverage on data to make better policies and measure the impact of policies. So hopefully something that we can all collaborate on when it's time.
Yeah, that would be very interesting to work on. So that what I want to even lean into now goes into the effect of having policies that are not domestic, right? And one of those effects is that our policy or growth among sectors in Nigeria or even among geographical areas is uneven. So growth within the rural area or rural communities doesn't balance out with what is available in, say, the urban area. So vulnerable groups are being left behind, in essence, is what I'm saying. So how can smart policies within the context of what we just discussed ensure that there's collective growth, that growth is meeting, the needs of both sides of the equation?
Okay, thank you for that. For me, I believe that our policies need to be inclusive. Our policy making process, at the end of the day, if you don't start with the first stage, which is the problem identification, which involves building the consensus, which involves actually reaching out to the right stakeholder groups, you're going to end up with policies that are not inclusive at the end of the day. Because if I'm not involved in the process, then you're not going to think about me. You're not going to factor in what my pain points are. And we have this challenge in Nigeria where most times it's a top-down approach. Everybody's focusing on the center, everybody's focusing on the cities, and we don't think about the people in the rural communities. These rural communities are the ones who provide our food in terms of agriculture. These rural communities, there's so much that they have to offer. You have a lot of women there, you have a lot of youth there. And so we need to make sure that they are part of the process. There are so many groups, there's so many institutions that we have, even in our tradition. When you talk about the traditional rulers, the age grades, you talk about the market women associations, you talk about, there's so many groups that are at the grassroots level. You notice that most times when policies are being designed, if you're in the National Assembly, for instance, and there's a public hearing, have you ever seen somebody representing a market women or representing?
Definitely not.
It's the posh organizations, the CSEA,
the people that can come in fancy cars.
Thank you. That can speak to
exactly.
So those are the people that you see. And unfortunately, we have a blind spot, and those people make up 95%, maybe
of the
80%
population
of our population, but they're not included. So that's a big challenge.
So if you mentioned that, part of the people that grassroots are, organizations that include civil society organizations, women groups, youth groups. So these people are what form the base of our economy. And oftentimes, these same groups have very low trust in the government because, like we mentioned, policies are good in writing, implementation is very weak. So trust is low and there are no methods of ensuring accountability. So what do you think are the mechanisms that government can put in place or reforms that are important to ensure that at least there are accountability metrics set before the government?
Okay, thank you. Just to also mention, one of the hats I wear is I also support the Office of the Special Advisor to the President on Policy and Coordination, Hadiza Bala Usman, and she has been championing this initiative, and she set up a committee which is focused on the entire policy development management framework for the country. We realized during the course of that work that Nigeria does not have a unified format or templates. Sometimes you realize that the awareness level is very low. We collaborated with NIPS and also NESG, some other think tanks. In fact, during the launch at the Villa, CCE was there as well. CC was there, the ED, Dr. Chuka was also there, and a couple of other leading organizations. We have a big challenge that the entire system needs an overhaul, honestly, when it comes to policy making and implementation. So when you talk about the fact that what needs to be done, so much needs to be done. Even from the level of knowledge, a lot of policymakers, it will shock you to know that they don't even know, even at that level, you see that people don't even know what a policy should look like, what process should the policy making process go through, who should be included, what is stakeholder engagement, what is, all those things people don't even know about. And that's why some people just rely on maybe consultants to prepare a policy, or they just download anything from the internet, or
Yeah, and that even encourages making policies based on emotions when you don't know what the due processes are.
Exactly. So because we don't have a data-driven, approach, the funny thing is that a lot of our ministries have the departments of statistics. They usually supposed to have statisticians who are supposed to be. But if you look at most of those ministries, those departments are underfunded, and a lot of people there don't have their mandate. So
that seems to be the major problem.
We have very weak. Exactly, and so we have a challenge where people that are supposed to be doing what they're supposed to be doing don't even know sometimes that that's what they're supposed to be doing. And rather, the incentives for doing policy, sometimes, people do things like, oh, this is raining now, we can get a kickback from this, or we can get something, But you talked about solutions, and so I need to just come in with the solutions. We need to have a community of practice made up of both the civil servants, the appointees, the policymakers, even our political office holders, because a lot of our policies stem from the manifestos of the political parties. So if I become a president, for instance, President Tinubu has a renewed hope agenda, and there are certain sectors that are listed there. So most times it needs to flow from even the political parties, right? And then at the same time, countries also have, like Nigeria, we had our national development plans, which we renew from time to time. Right. Although a lot of people complain that, yes, we have these visions and national plans, but then it doesn't really fit into the day-to-day. When people are creating policy, they don't even remember that there's a national plan.
That is an average Nigerian living a day-to-day life that these policies might have a direct impact on.
Exactly. And for instance, with China, they do have a national plan, which is a very long-term plan, which they review every 5 years. So the point is, if your national plan, for instance, involves eradicating poverty by 2050, increasing education by 80% by 2050, I'm just giving an instance. If you're then going and creating policies and creating budgets, and there is no provision for education, there's no provision for poverty alleviation, then we know that you just put that vision and that plan there. You don't have any intention really to implement. Your day-to-day actions are not tied to what your grand vision or your plan is. So there has to be that synergy. It needs to flow from the leadership at the top, but not only just the leadership at the top. We need to think about all the tiers of government. Are they working in harmony? Are they coordinated? And when I say all the tiers of government, it's down to the local governments. Because at the end of the day, the only place where you can really have transformational growth is at the grassroots level. So the local governments, and I'm happy that there was a court decision which has enforced that local government autonomy. And now there's this push to get states to give money to their local government, because I'll still say a lot of the scrutiny is at the federal level, but we have to look at the state governments, we have to look at the local governments. Are they actually implementing policies to the end user? Because it's not going to be easy for somebody at the presidential level to know what a town union or to know what is happening at the grassroots level of every state.
Right.
It's not going to work. So it's that local government that actually needs to be gathering the data of the citizens, gathering their feedback on programs and initiatives. It's at that grassroots level that governance really needs to be felt. And unfortunately, that's not the case. So we have a lot of work to do in strengthening our institutions, especially as subnationals, making sure that our governors are not emperors. They are not just, so for instance, with the removal of full subsidy, they're saying, oh, more money are going to states. Okay, so with the money that is going to states, what are they using the money for? Who is giving
how
accounts?
is it trickling down to the local government? What's the flow?
Because to be very honest with you, policy implementation requires money. It's not just to say, yes, you have a policy to improve education. Okay, how much are you spending on education? How much have you budgeted
for education?
Budget? What's in the budget? Because that's how I know that you're really serious about eradicating education. So policy making doesn't just stand on its own. It doesn't just stand in a vacuum. There have to be actions, there have to be spending, there have to be reforms, there have to be things that will go hand in hand for us to know that you're serious about this policy or this plan or this vision. So, like I said, the whole system needs an overhaul. That's why I took time to talk about all the tiers of government, what is happening and what needs to improve. That's the only way we can have our institutions to be strengthened.
That's interesting. And one thing you mentioned while answering, while speaking on the last question was that Nigeria has very weak institutions, right? Our institutions are weak, and that's in effect is affecting implementation. And I'd even like to say that these weak institutions are not just affecting, say, the individuals, like we earlier spoke about, that's the everyday Nigerian. It's affecting businesses, it's affecting sectors, right? And this weak institutions also lead to weak infrastructure and bureaucratic bottlenecks. So what policies do you think could better support entrepreneurs? What smart policies do you think could better support entrepreneurs, research hubs, and then lead to innovation in Nigeria?
Thank you so much. That's an excellent question. When you talk about entrepreneurship, I think our government doesn't pay enough attention to entrepreneurs. Yes, I know that we have SMEDEN, we have even BOI and the Development Bank of Nigeria.
A lot of the organizations.
We have a lot of organizations in quotes that are there to support entrepreneurship, innovation, industrialization. However, this is an area that I think that we rank very low as a country. A lot of our entrepreneurs do not have access to basic energy. They have to use a lot of generators. The levers and the infrastructure that is needed to thrive as an entrepreneur in Nigeria is just not available, whether we like it or not. One of the also critical issues I've mentioned that empower, one of the critical issues is access to capital. There's a debt of capital. If you go to a typical bank in Nigeria, you're looking at a loan with an interest rate of 30% or more. There is no way in the world that you
for a small business
development and a small business. There's not. What business are you going to do that you'll be able to pay 30% interest rate? 30%. So that means you can't even go to the bank. Now, what are the other funding sources? Where are you going to get the money from? Do you know that unfortunately you end up seeing people having to go to even things that are not so legal just to get access to capital?
Yeah, like loan sharks. And sometimes those things are very detrimental to their businesses. Not sometimes, most times.
Most times. And there is no country in the world that has been able to develop without capital, especially patient capital. Look at the US, look at China. In China, the banks are very quick to lend to businessmen. The government, even the government-owned banks, if you're going into a project, capital is not a problem. They're giving you at a very cheap interest rate. The US, you have a lot of risk capital. You have a lot of, apart from even the banks, you have a lot of angel investors, you have a lot of VCs and all that. In Nigeria, please tell me, where can an average entrepreneur go and get money? So if we don't solve these issues, if we don't invest in our entrepreneurs, the first policy for me, if you ask me, that anybody has to do to support entrepreneurs is providing access to capital, because you need access to capital to fund entrepreneurship and innovation. Now, let me talk about innovation. Most countries that are productive leverage technology. There has to be a growth in technology adoption. So basically what I mean is you cannot be at a level of, for instance, agriculture, subsistence farming. You're just using hoe and cutlass. Your productivity level is going to be very low. Your standards are going to be very, very low. If you don't adopt innovation and technology in agriculture, you're not going to be able to meet up with the world. You're not going to be able to export. You're not going to be able to, earn that level of revenue. So as a country, you're going to remain poor if majority of your population are still doing subsistence farming and they're doing it with hoe and cutlass. They're not doing it with tractors. They're not doing it with smart irrigation and all that stuff. So the point I'm trying to make is any policy that doesn't focus on funding innovation and funding entrepreneurship and funding industrialization as a whole is going to keep us where we are. And I believe that, people are going to say you need money. Yes, we do need money, but there are things that we can do that will make our country more business and more investment friendly. I don't expect government to do all the work. I expect them to create an enabling environment for the private sector to then come in, be it to mobilize domestic capital, but also to utilize foreign direct investment. Because we have to understand that Nigerians have money and Nigerians are even taking their money abroad. So that capital flight that is happening, if you can stay within the country, we will have more money going towards our entrepreneurs and all that. Now, what can government do to create an environment? The first thing, which doesn't involve money here, is rule of law, access to justice. Being able to have consequences for bad behavior. Honestly speaking,
I think that's even one thing that's really, really lacking in the Nigerian, system. The access to justice is just really poor. It's almost like it's the one with the biggest pockets that can afford to get justice. It really feeds into what you're saying.
So you have to be a big man. And, and even with that, so you see, someone was telling me that they were surprised when they came to Nigeria and they saw one man, a rich person with like 20 mopos and everything. And I'm like,
that's normal.
So people that are supposed to be guarding the citizens, you go to areas, you're hearing of armed robbery and all these things, and you're thinking, what's the ratio? Where's the security level? And when something bad happens, are people brought to book? The rule of law, meaning that nobody is above the law. Meaning that if you're a senator, a governor, a minister, a president, whatever you are, if you break the law, if you commit a crime, you'll be imprisoned. If I see a big man being in prison, I, a small man, will not want to break the law. And guess what that does? The funny thing is that we don't talk about this rule of law access just when we talk about economic policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy. But why I'm a lawyer by training, and why I'm talking about this is most people take their money to environments where they can get safety and recourse. If I'm an investor and I swindled, will I come back? Will I put my money in Nigeria? Most people, and I want to tie this to the startups that you talked about. Most of our startups in Nigeria are actually not necessarily Nigerian owned. Most of them have holding companies in Delaware, in the different parts of the world where you have to register your company, domicile it before you can actually get investments from all these VCs and all these angel investors. Meaning that most of them, if somebody tells you they raise $5 million, $10 million, that money is not in Nigeria. That money is sitting down in America, it's sitting down in London, it's sitting down somewhere else in Dubai. That money is actually not in our country. Because those people prefer to keep their money where they know their money is safe. That if anything happens, if they want to enforce their contract, they can go to a court, they can get judgment, they can get, So if our institutions are not working, people feel like it's an anyhow, any which way, every way it goes, they're not going to come and invest here. So that's one of the things that we need to work on and ensure that people have recourse. There is punishment for bad behavior. We're fighting corruption and we're making sure that people who do the wrong thing are brought to book. I want to stop here because I know that we're really spent for time. So I'll just let you maybe ask me one or two questions so that we can just round up.
So I have just one final question.
Perfect.
Right. So we've spoken so much about, the effect of policies on institutions and on persons and on society, the need for justice. So what do you think the government can even do to start? So where should they place their first foot in when talking about smart policies in Nigeria?
Okay, so I want to say that there's some things that they've worked on which are good. Like I know the tax reforms, the proposed tax reforms that have been brought in place this year. Now we're left to see how it's going to be implemented. The ease of doing business really needs to be looked at. Digitizing our systems. Now, if I'm a business person, I think they said Nigerians will pay like unofficially like 200 and something taxes, or the different points, or even 300 and something. At every point in time, you're being harassed, you're having to do so many things, so definitely I like the fact that there's some proposed reforms and that are happening in that space. We're yet to see how it is going to work, and hopefully we hope that it will be implemented in a good way and in the right way. So for me, what the government can start with now is looking at the things that have worked already. The problem I have sometimes is that the continuity in government, sometimes something good is actually working, but they just stop it abruptly, or maybe a government changes and then they want to start their own thing. There have been some policies that have worked in the past. We need to go back to the policies that have worked. As a country, we have, okay, let me just give you an instance, the Shopee program. There was this UN project. I remember because Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala was in government, and that was a program that entrepreneurs were able to get access to capital, capacity building, and it led to job creation. We know that our entrepreneurs are the engine room; they're the lifeline of our society, of our economy. So, projects that have worked in the past to support entrepreneurs, we need to look at it, and we need to replicate and expand and scale. We also need continuity. You shouldn't just stop something halfway because you're not the one who started it. If you see that it's actually working and there are dividends to show for it, then you should also ensure that you continue it. And then most importantly, we need to focus on our governance. Technology has revolutionized every area. You have the fintechs, you have the agri-techs, but why is it that in governance, we're still using paper? We're not leveraging data. We're not analyzing it in the way we're talking about AI. We're in the fourth industrial revolution. Can't we make sure that everybody has a national identity? Everybody has their biometric captured, so that if I want to do something, I don't have to start going in person. If I want to vote, if I want to do so many things, I want to register, I don't have to go and queue up, making everything so hard and so difficult. We can have a government that is more progressive, that makes service delivery to citizens easy and effective, that leverages data from communities, not just the cities and the urban centers, but the rural communities, making sure that they are also part of the data capturing that we're talking about, that their data is captured and their voices and their pain points are captured, so that our policies can be more evidence-based, more user-centric, and more fit for purpose. We need to look away from this copy and paste approach of just adopting things that are working in different countries, in America, in Australia, and no. We don't need to outsource our thinking. We have bright minds in Nigeria. We have people, look at this center now for the study of economies of Africa, Africa Policy Conversations, which is an organization which I founded. We have a think tank which we do a lot of research. We're working on a GovTech solution. And then there are other bodies as well. We always look away from our universities. We need to strengthen our universities. We need to have more centers of excellence, centers of research and innovation. That research and innovation should not stand alone. It should inform policies. Our policymakers should not just wake up today and create a policy without measuring the impact, without looking at the data. No, we need to move away from that. We're in the 21st century. We need to look at what has worked for other countries. So at the end of the day, we have the resources, even our private sector. We need more knowledge brokers, like they say, people who can look at the research, look at the data, and make intelligent, decisions.
Conclusions,
and have to work with our policymakers, our lawmakers. It shouldn't just be politicized. It shouldn't be about vested interests. It shouldn't be about corruption. It should be about nation building. It should be about good governance. It should be about accountability and a better life for all our citizens.
That was amazing. I like how you ended on the note of saying that policies should benefit the people and should benefit the citizens that are living within the country. So thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the CC podcast. It was really nice having you. I like how passionate the conversation was. And I got to learn a lot as well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much, Onyinye, for having me. I had an amazing time, and I look forward to being in touch with you all and collaborating with other like-minded organizations for greater impact. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the CC podcast. I enjoyed how passionate this conversation was. I learned a lot, and I hope you did too. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. See you next time.